The documentary you are about to see is not fiction. Nothing has been made up. All of it is all too painfully real. The video is called What We Have Lost, and it chronicles the widespread changes and destruction that have taken place in the 2,000-year-old Roman Catholic Church since the end of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. Hello. My name is David Allen White, and I am a professor of English at the United States Naval Academy. But it's not in that capacity that I'm speaking to you now. I come to you today to introduce a video, and I come as simply a Catholic man. I call myself a traditional Catholic. That is a distinction that the video will make clear to you. The video you are about to see is a documentary. It's not fiction. Nothing has been made up. Everything is real, unfortunately. Much of what you will see may disturb you, but all of the material has been taken from actual events taking place in the world. The video is called What We Have Lost, and it chronicles the widespread changes in the Roman Catholic Church, a church that has lasted for 2,000 years, changes that have taken place since the Second Vatican Council ended in 1965. As I said, much of this may surprise you. Some of it will shock you, and some of it, I hope, will sadden you. But it is to inform you of these changes. It is to help you understand why they were made, how they were made, and who made them. To give you all of this information. That is why the video was made. The Roman Catholic Church, over her 2,000-year history, has always taught that sacred tradition is one of the means by which God revealed himself to man, along with the sacred scriptures. Protestants, on the other hand, believe that sacred scripture alone is the source of revelation. God's revelation came to man for the first 400 years of the church by means of sacred tradition, for the Bible itself was not assembled and officially put together until the Council of Carthage in the late 4th century. During those first 400 years, the dogmas and doctrines and teachings of the church were passed from Christ to his apostles, and from his apostles throughout the rest of the world, by each one teaching one. And that tradition of the church has continued throughout the centuries. The 7 sacraments have been the means by which God has brought his grace to mankind. And the holy sacrifice of the Mass has always occupied a central place among those sacraments, for it is the means by which God has asked us to worship him. After the Second Vatican Council, there were significant changes that were made in the Mass. Most people believe that the shift was simply one from Latin to the vernacular of English for those of us in the English-speaking countries. But in fact, the changes go much deeper than that, and they were deliberately made and deviously made. Others believe there was simply an aesthetic change. They prefer the beauties of the old Mass as opposed to the guitars and liturgical dance of the Novus Ordo rite. But again, as this video will show to you, the changes are much different and much more serious. Others claim that those of us who are traditional Catholics are simply nostalgic for the faith that we once knew, longing to go back to a time that is now gone. Well, I, for one, am certainly not nostalgic, for I was not raised a Catholic. I was raised a Protestant, and then, during my university years in the late 60s, I became an atheist. Who didn't? It was later, in the late 70s, that I was received into the Roman Catholic Church, and largely because of intellectual arguments, along, of course, with God's grace. The great British writer, Evelyn Waugh, said that the Roman Catholic Church presented to mankind a coherent philosophical system combined with intransigent historical claims. That coherent philosophical system and that incredible history over the last 2,000 years is what has brought many of us into the church. So we do not feel nostalgic for those things we never knew. But having been Protestants or atheists or any number of other different faiths or combinations thereof, we know what's Catholic. We know what brought us into the church. We know what it is that we hope to find in the sacraments of the church. We Catholics have an obligation, and that is to see that the faith that was passed to us gets passed on to future generations. Those who went before us fought, suffered, and often died so that the Catholic faith could be handed on from generation to generation, and we have that same obligation, although we are presented with a special problem. The video will raise some questions in your mind. Is the church still Catholic? Has she lost the faith? Are those shepherds who were put in charge of the Catholic flock turning into wolves who in fact are attacking the flock rather than preserving it? We must remember that during his pontificate, Pope Paul VI stated that the smoke of Satan had entered the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, when the Second Vatican Council opened the church to the world, that smoke came in. It means that our fight is now often, sadly, within Mother Church herself. Nevertheless, as Catholics, we possess hope. We were told by our Lord Jesus Christ that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. We have the promise of Our Lady made at Fatima at the beginning of the 20th century, that in the end her Immaculate Heart would triumph. We have this to look forward to. We know what the outcome will be. We've read the end of the book. But we cannot fool ourselves about where we are now. And in order to understand the current fight and where we are now and what we have lost, here is the documentary.
For nearly 2,000 years, the Roman Catholic Church was recognized by its faithful as the one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. A worldwide church bound together not only by a common rite of Mass said in a common language, but by shared beliefs, honored traditions, and by the proclamations of infallible dogma. Today, that church is a house divided against itself, split between traditionalists and modernists, between the sanctity of the old and the liberalism of the new. Once, the magnificent spires of Catholic churches around the world reached like arms outstretched to heaven, proudly proclaiming the majesty of Christ the King. And holy and timeless statuary and painting stood in silent tribute to that same Christ and his glorious Virgin Mother, while solemn chants or soaring hymns of praise resounded in tribute to the triune God. But the 20th century has seen a breakthrough of the smoldering forces of liberal reform. Pope John the 23rd, a well-known modernist, voiced his desire to let a little fresh air into the church. So, in 1962, he symbolically opened the windows by convening the Second Vatican Council. As if in some Satan-inspired replay of the 16th century Protestant Revolution, the Council wasted no time in flirting with many of the same errors committed by such heretics as Luther, Cranmer, Zwingli, Calvin, and others, whose influence had once swept across Europe and beyond. Council modernists even included those who had previously attacked the fundamental doctrines of the Church, who had called into question Christ's divinity, as well as the perpetual virginity of his Blessed Mother. Plus, they had challenged the truth of original sin, hell, and transubstantiation. And their influence was manifested in Vatican II proclamations that eased the way for eventually altering the rites of all the sacraments. Demands for church reform sounded throughout St. Peter's, echoing the demands of Martin Luther some 400 years earlier. And even before the end of the Council's final session, changes had crept into the Mass. Vatican II came to a close in December of 1965. Now, the liberal forces that had been warned against by previous popes were released in all their misguided fury. The genie of modernism was out of the bottle at last.
People give out communion. Everybody's a minister of the Eucharist, my brothers and sisters. Do you know why we changed that? Why change that?
And the spirit of the Council would lead to the birth of the Novus Ordo, the new order of the Mass, and in effect, to the beginning of a new church. Even Paul VI, ever a proponent of Vatican II, would later acknowledge that clouds, storms, and darkness had followed the Council, and the smoke of Satan had entered the church. But not even he could foresee the destruction and desecration to come. One obvious aspect of the Vatican II revolution is the change in church architecture. In the past 30-some years, many magnificent old structures have been modified or destroyed. And following Vatican II, the hierarchy directed that great churches, those that are also works of art, should no longer be built because they are an affront to the poor. So, with rare exceptions, the construction of new magnificent structures dedicated to the honor of God are discouraged. And Judas's admonition to Mary Magdalene that money not be wasted on the service of our Lord is repeated in the socially correct sensitivity that inspires the design of so many of today's Catholic churches. Most of the new structures are not only aesthetically bankrupt, they occasionally invite comparison to pagan shrines. And others are no longer called churches, but communities. Yet while church exteriors have supposedly become less offensive to the poor, their interiors look more like barren auditoriums or theaters, even New Age temples, rather than Catholic places of worship. At the same time, older, once sacred church interiors have been transformed into mere shells of their former grace and solemnity. Traditional and holy furnishings that for generations had identified them as uniquely Catholic have been doomed. In what can be likened to the destruction and desecration wrought by the French Revolution's reign of terror, the years following Vatican II have seen the virtual gutting and ransacking of Catholic churches throughout the world. Michael Matt, editor of The Remnant, describes his own chilling memories of a similar experience from his childhood.
It is also the church that when the changes came about, the high altar, they took a chainsaw or whatever type of saw cuts marble, hacked it up, And to this day, if any of you ever come to visit the remnant, I can take you to the place, to this parking lot, again, over this church where I was baptized, and show you where pieces of the high altar are being used as curbstones in the parking lot. Now this is...
In imitation of an heretical practice initiated in the 16th century, marble altars have been replaced by tables, even in what had once been the most Catholic of all Catholic churches. Now they are made of anything from wood to plastic. And without so much as an altar stone, they lack even the sacredness that was found in the makeshift battlefront altars of World War II. Yet these butcher blocks seem perfectly suited for what in the Novus Ordo Church has become a communal meal, rather than the unbloody sacrifice mandated by Christ. Perhaps Luther has triumphed after all in the modern church. And our Lord himself has been relegated to a position of obscurity. Not only has his image been stripped from crosses in church after church, if indeed there are any crosses left, but tabernacles containing the Blessed Sacrament, along with sanctuary lamps, have been removed from the central place of honor on the altar and consigned to insignificant alcoves, or shunted off to different rooms altogether. All this in spite of a 1957 decree by the Sacred Congregation of Rites categorically forbidding that tabernacles be situated outside the altar. In St. John chapter 20, verse 2, Mary Magdalene lamented, "They have taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have laid him." Tragically, her words live again today. Moreover, images of our Blessed Mother, once prominent features of every Catholic church in the world, have in all too many cases joined the statues of saints and angels that are now so conspicuously absent. Indeed, if statuary or art can still be found, it is often grotesque or blasphemous, such as a feminist depiction of the Last Supper, a monstrance made from a wine bottle, or a modernist representation of the Blessed Mother that is more likely to inspire diabolical thoughts than sacred ones. Crucifixes have become abstract images, or have been replaced by a risen Christ. And even the bare Protestant-like crosses have in many cases been replaced by plus signs. The list of traditional church fixtures that have fallen victim to modernism is as long as it is sad. Kneelers and altar rails are no longer built in new churches and have been removed from many old ones. Side altars have all but vanished, and stained glass windows which once depicted church history and the lives of the saints have been displaced by useless mosaics signifying nothing. So much for the spirit of Vatikan II. Once Catholic churches were solemn places of worship, where silence and dignity were maintained out of reverence for the actual presence of Christ. Today, they're more often social gathering places, filled with irreverent noise and hubbub that befits a movie theater or sports arena. And in many cases, reverent contemplation or prayer has been replaced by interpretive dancing. Just as modesty in dress fell victim to the excesses of the 60s, today women's head coverings and men's conservative clothing have given way to attire that is better suited for backyard barbecues, if even there. Moreover, these external signs of disrespect are not limited to the laity. In the post-conciliar church, the clergy seem to want to dress like laymen in public and act as entertainers during Mass. And not only are the ideas of heaven, hell, and purgatory being debated anew, even the concept of limbo is reinterpreted in the sanctuary. And in many parishes, the role of the priest has become less one of spiritual leader and more one of social worker, or that of an activist, who seems more concerned with so-called political correctness than saving immortal souls. Nuns, as well, have all but abandoned their traditional habits. John Benari, editor of Catholic Family News, viewed these changes from a front row seat in Catholic schools.
When I was in first grade, all we saw of Sister Joan Labouré was her hands and her face. And by the time I got to 8th grade, I knew that Sister Kevin Leonard had red hair and varicose veins.
Even some princes of the church have adopted vestments intended as political or social statements rather than designations of their holy positions. while others sport pagan-inspired costumes in the name of diversity and enculturation. Pope Paul VI set the precedent for change when in 1964 he surrendered his papal ring and crucifix to the Buddhist U Thant, then Secretary General of the United Nations. And while addressing that one world body, the Pope said, "The peoples of the earth turn to the United Nations as the last hope of concord and peace." A curious statement for the Vicar of Christ. The new papal crucifix, subsequently adopted by Paul VI and carried by succeeding popes, features a distorted, bent cross and a gangly, spread-legged Christ, an image attributed to Satanists of the 5th century. And the papal tiara, its 3 tiers representing the Holy Trinity, has been abandoned. Paul VI never wore it again after his investiture, choosing a bishop's mitre instead, and proclaimed in 1975 that no future pontiff was required to wear the crown. Thus his successor, John Paul I, chose not to be crowned pope and declined a traditional coronation. He opted instead for a ceremony that he helped compose, and was the first pope never to wear the crown, which had always symbolized leadership of the Universal Catholic Church. John Paul II followed his lead. But ecclesiastical dress, or lack of it, is not the only thing in the new church that shocks the senses. For centuries, solemn, hauntingly beautiful Gregorian chants were considered the official music of the church. And as time went on, some of the most magnificent music ever composed by the great masters was written for use during the celebration of the Mass. And the influence of such music has gone far beyond its religious origins. Dr. David Allen White, professor of English at the U.S. Naval Academy and a classical music scholar, had this to say.
Well, that Mass gave us Western music. The oldest Western music we have written down is Gregorian chant, and if you take a music history course, you're going to begin with chant and go through church music, and it won't be secularized till much later. But when it is, you're still going to have Mozart writing masses and Haydn writing masses, and you're going to even have someone who was just crotchety and cranky and probably had a good reason to be because of his deafness, Beethoven, who wrestled with God his whole life, still writing the great Missa Solemnis and seeing a priest on his deathbed. I mean, that is the tradition of music.
These classical masterpieces remain examples of some of man's most noble and uplifting creations, a cultural as well as a religious legacy. And what is the legacy of post-Vatican II music? But there are changes in the modern church beyond new sights and sounds. Changes that are less conspicuous, but far more important. Undoubtedly influenced by the presence of the large contingent of non-Catholic observers at the Council, reforms mandated by Vatican II's Constitution of the Liturgy led ultimately to sweeping revisions in the rites of the 7 sacraments. During the reign of Pope Paul VI alone, they all underwent major change. Prime illustration is the sacrament of baptism. The new rite, seen here during a Novus Ordo Mass and performed by a deacon while the priest looks on, bears a striking similarity to Luther's revised order of baptism dating from 1526. The traditional Catholic rite incorporates such things as exorcism by breathing on the candidate, saying the required prayers, the giving of salt, and anointings before and after baptism. All elements that were eliminated by Luther and that have been eliminated in the modern church, so that now it seems the baptismal ceremony is little more than an initiation into the Christian community, rather than redemption from original sin.